All right, welcome everybody to episode 1 of Two Dogs, One Pod, where Matt and I will be bringing on Matthew Leffler, the Armchair attorney, to go over the recent FTC's ruling on non-competes and more.
That should be fun. We're still dealing with some technical stuff, guys. So if you're looking to watch, it'll be on Will's page for this one as we're figuring things out. But yeah, we're excited. It should be fun. We just want to shout out to a couple of our sponsors. Obviously, the company I work for and Will's company are in there, HG Ships and Black Box. But more importantly, I want to shout out Sales Dash CRM, a freight-specific CRM. Big fan of theirs. So when they asked to be a sponsor, it was an easy yes. Definitely go check out Josh over at Sales Dash. It should be fun, Will. I mean, we've known each other for a minute and been talking about this for a while, so it's fun to finally get it going.
Yeah, looking forward to it. And additionally, these live streams will be edited and uploaded to. We're going to get some Spotify, Facebook, YouTube pages set up, so they'll be there to listen if you're not able to tune in on the live stream. But without further ado, I'm going to throw Matthew in here, and we'll get started.
Sounds good.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for having me on the very first episode. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, happy Friday. Thanks for coming.
They said it couldn't be done, but look at us. We did it.
Here we are.
We made it to Friday.
Well, it's probably been a busy month for you. I was going to say all this news. I mean, we'll get into it, but not only the non-compete, but the big ruling on the labor and the minimum salaries, and been a lot of legal logistics news. I feel like in the last month or so.
I often find myself at the intersection of supply chain and logistics and the law. And we can't get out of the supply chain. We can't get out of the law. And when these things cross, it's always an interesting time. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of break down some of the most interesting legal things happening in our ridiculous industry that we find ourselves in.
I'm sure. Or go ahead, Will. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, it seems like you've been on lots of shows, but I mean, I guess just to start off, like the hot topic, right, is the non-competes. And I mean, at least for me, I've seen a lot of different takes on it, but I don't have like a full, complete understanding of what that means and what it entails, or the ramifications of, are they enforceable, are they unenforceable, the time, and then maybe Chamber of Commerce. Can you break it down for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So
how much level?
In order for people to fully kind of understand what a non-competition agreement is, I need to kind of break down a very specific type of employment contract. These are what we call perks, post-employment restrictive covenants. These could be your non-competes, your non-solicits, your non-disparagements, your non-disclosures, all of the contracts that an employer gives you and says, hey, now that you're with us, if you ever leave us, here are the things you're going to be bound by. A non-compete is a type of contract that restricts your ability to do a certain job. And they have three real core elements. There's this idea of a geographic restriction. So how broad is it? Is it your city? Is it your state? Is it your county? Is it your entire country? Is it the world? It also has a time aspect. So is it for 3 months? Is it for 6 months? Is it for 2 years? And then finally, they have this idea of what is the business that you no longer can do. This is the restricted business or the restricted activity. Now, what makes people kind of surprised is just how pervasive and pernicious these things are. Over 30 million working Americans have a non-compete as a condition of a job that they have. That's 1 in 5 workers, and they're everywhere, every single industry. So for the better part of a few years, non-competes have been one of my favorite windmills to tilt at. And so I get really excited when we can talk about what these things are and help people understand what the FTC was doing. But as a high level, it's a contract that binds somebody after they left a job, and it doesn't go away until that time duration passes.
Yeah, and I think it's important when you're kind of starting off the differences. What I've seen a lot of times is people get confused on the differences in a non-solicitor and non-compete, right? Two entirely different contracts. And I've seen a lot of people, I think they're one and the same. And from my understanding, one could be enforceable and the other one could be proved unenforceable depending on when you're describing the time, location. So if I have a non-compete, I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, and the non-compete's for the world, right? Like that might not be hold up in court, as opposed to if it's, hey, Birmingham, Alabama, that might stand.
Yeah. And so with the non-solicitation agreement, it's the kind of contract that says, hey, former worker, you can't call on our customers and you can't call on your former colleagues. Nothing in the non-solicit stops the former customer or the former coworkers from reaching out to you. So they can still reach out. It's just you who are prevented. So you can still do your trade, you can still do your practice. But if you have a non-competition agreement, it is by design intended to make it so that you cannot work in a similar industry for a period of time. That's just how those things are built.
I think it also depends too. Maybe you can correct me, Matt, but a lot of it depends. So much is different between states, right? On terms of,
That's right.
how enforceable it is, or the different wording. I don't know if you see this much, but I've had some people ask me, some non-solicits say directly, or some non-solicits say, directly or indirectly. So even if a customer reaches out to you, that could still be a violation of a non-solicit.
That's a great call out. So every single state differs on how they enforce and regulate non-competition agreements and non-solicitation agreements for that matter. And in the FTC's move, this is kind of what we can build back into what FTC did, was they were watching how millions of Americans are locked into these contracts. A non-solicitation is about, again, you reaching out. If someone else reached back to you, like a former customer or former coworker, that's a non-competition agreement. Now, you can call it whatever you want, but the courts are going to look at this and go, this is a non-compete. And so what we found with the FTC back in January of 2023 is they put out a proposed rule. And this proposed rule would ban non-competition agreements in virtually every single circumstance, except for the sale of a business. And no one here is fighting to make it so you can not have a non-compete when you sell a company. You sell a company, you're getting that non-compete. But literally every other job, they would be taken away. So over the course of a few months, 26,000 people submitted comments. Some of them are organizations, some of them are interest groups, but the vast majority of all of these comments said, these things are awful. And here's what happened to me. Here's my story. And they are in every single aspect of our working Americans. This is for medical workers, where you're a doctor or you're a nurse. They're in sales organizations. They're in freight. They're in literally roofing and contracting, anything you can imagine. Non-competes have found their way to sneak into how we deal with workers. And it is this really interesting phenomenon of companies bringing new talent in, not disclosing the non-competition agreement as part of the deal, and then bringing them out after they've already joined the company. And the numbers are staggering. Between 30 and 40% of all non-competes are for workers making under $20 an hour. So these things are not just the C-suite. This is for everybody. And again, they're designed to suppress wages and put people into positions where they can't earn a living. And they're absolutely terrible.
I think the interesting part too is with this ruling, it's retroactive. So like some states, for example, Minnesota banned non-competes last summer, but if you signed a non-compete in 2009, 2021, anytime before they banned it, it's still enforceable. But this FTC, from my understanding, goes retroactive. So it doesn't matter when you signed it, it would be no longer enforceable.
Yeah, that's a very good call out. So the initial rule has changed from the final rule. The final rule does in fact ban non-competes in every aspect. So the old ones that are in place, those are still banned. There's a carve out for what they call kind of executive level folks making over $151,000 a year. And they basically said, if this person who's making over $151,000 a year and has decision-making authority, so think C-suite, really high-level folks, those non-competes are still there, but they can't be made going forward. Now, the reality is that's not the end of the story. We are at the very, very beginning. And during the comment period with the FTC's proposed rule, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out and said, hey, if you do this, we're going to sue you. And in fact, the day after the actual rule was finalized, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce filed their lawsuit. And so we are now in the next phase of this period, which is the litigation to see if they're actually enforceable or not. There's a real question about the FTC's authority to make a rule banning non-competition agreements.
Is there any kind of timeline for that litigation or an expected? Is it
Absolutely. So this is what I love about the law. So like everything's about processes and procedures. And so I love civil procedures. So for anyone who's watching us and listening to this is a lawyer really getting excited about process.
And if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments and we'll get them answered.
And I will give the disclaimer. This is not legal advice. Nothing I say is intended for legal advice. If you think you need a lawyer, you probably need a lawyer, and don't take legal advice from a podcast. But here's what happens. The FTC makes their final rule on the 23rd of April. It must be put into the thing called the Federal Register. It has to be in the Federal Register for 120 days. After that 120 days passes, then it becomes a final rule. But in the same breath, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce files a lawsuit in Texas. This is actually in the Eastern District of Texas, the Tyler Division. And they challenge the FTC's initial rule, the final rule, and they ask for what we call an injunction. An injunction, and anyone who's dealt with non-competes or non-solicits, like in litigation, you know what an injunction is. An injunction is a court order stop. You're done. This is over. We're pausing this. In the parlance of the law, we kind of call that enjoin. You enjoin the rule. So what's going to happen is over the next few weeks are very specific timelines. So the FTC has until May 31st of 2024 to file their response to the lawsuit by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce will have until June 12th to reply to the documentation that's filed by the FTC. Then the FTC has until June 19th to file their supplemental documentation. So what we know will happen is sometime between maybe end of June into early July is when we're going to get a rule by the court in Texas, the district court. But that's not how this ends. No matter who wins, no matter who loses, the loser is going to appeal. And they will appeal to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit is a federal appellate court that will answer to anything that happens in Texas. Whatever happens at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, that's not the end of it. Someone will then, whoever loses, will appeal that. They'll either appeal that to the entire Fifth Circuit. We call that en banc because that's a cool thing to say, or it'll go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, here's the thing about SCOTUS, and that's the abbreviation for the Supreme Court of the United States. They don't have to take the case. They don't have to. But what we know about our current Supreme Court is they are deeply skeptical of the administrative agencies overreaching their authority. And that is the heart. That is the absolute heart of this lawsuit put out by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The question that we're asking ourselves is, does the FTC have the authority to go into the middle of a contract between 30 million Americans and their hiring entities and override them? Do they have that authority? And we call this the major questions doctrine. We also call this the non-delegation doctrine. All this is to say, we don't know the answer, but chances are very likely that if this goes to the United States Supreme Court, they will find in favor of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. If people think the FTC has saved them from non-competes, I am so sorry to tell you that is likely not the outcome to be anticipated. However, this is still really positive momentum. 26,000 of your fellow Americans participated in the democracy. The FTC made a rule, and now it's being litigated in the courts, and eventually it will be litigated in the courts of public opinion, because this is ultimately a very political question.
Yeah, it'll be interesting too, because, and I don't know if you've heard of this too, but a couple of people were talking. Maybe I read an article that, you know, if Congress actually voted on this, which there's been some talk, then it wouldn't have to go through all these appeals, get held up in court. You know, it would just be a law, and there's, you know, I guess some possibility that that could happen as well, right?
Yeah, so there actually is in Congress right now a bill called the Workforce Mobility Act, and it is a bipartisan bill. It has been stuck in committee for a very long time, and actually the Chamber of Commerce even talks about this. They say, look, if you want to ban these things, go through Congress. There's no question that Congress has the authority. The challenge here is that Americans have not made their voices heard. So if you want to see non-competes banned and actually stay a ban, You call your congressman, you email, you write them, they listen, they will follow you. And if you tell them to support the Workforce Mobility Act, they may. But that congressional legislation, if it were to pass, it would do the exact same thing as the FTC's rule, but so much worse. Ability to sue the former employers, a lot of other stuff would happen. But the reality is, this is a very political topic. It keeps wages very low, and there are incredibly powerful interests that do not want to see these things get banned.
Yeah, it makes sense. How often do you get people messaging you asking for advice with non-competes, non-solicits? I mean, I'd assume it'd be a lot with your platform and your experience and the nature of this topic.
Yeah, every day. I mean, the reality is like what I did. So my own background, I've had 4 non-competes presented to me in my career in supply chain. 2 of them I signed, 2 of them I refused to. This is the nature of this industry. I find myself oftentimes on Reddit or Twitter or LinkedIn, and someone messages me about having received or having been given a non-competition agreement or having signed one, never understanding what it was and having to explain those things. So a lot of my practice, which I don't really do much anymore, was a lot of pro bono work, helping people navigate a non-competition agreement. So these things are, like I said, they're pernicious. You get so many young people who sign a document not understanding it or realizing it, and then having to deal with it. I use this example. It's about half of America. If you had to provide $400 in 24 hours, they couldn't do it. They can't do it. So if you get someone a non-competition agreement, can they afford a lawyer? Do they even know how to find an attorney? And so this is the deeply unfair nature of non-competes. It's taking a legal doctrine, a legal type of maneuvering to trick somebody or convince them or put them in a position where they can't say no. And so I do encounter many non-competes. I've seen hundreds in my career. And I will say almost exclusively, you should never sign them. You should negotiate if you can, but if you can't get around them, don't work for the company. There's no value for you long term because you could be laid off and then you're still bound by the non-compete. You could be terminated for cause and you're still bound by the non-compete. You could quit because you don't like the people anymore. You're still bound by the non-compete. And there's this misnomer, and I hear it a lot. These things aren't enforceable. They're enforceable. I know
another part too, and I was curious if you touch on this because you see people all the time on LinkedIn. Oh, in this state, it's not enforceable, or in this state, it doesn't matter. But I think some people don't. Maybe I could be wrong, so you can correct me. But even if there's not a very strong case, the non-competes don't hold up in that case. You still have to defend yourself and go through all the court hearings and spend, tens of thousands of dollars in some cases. It's not just because it's loosely enforceable doesn't mean you don't have to defend it. I think
this is why I think people kind of confuse non-solicits and non-competes, because the way you enforce them are identical. This is what we do. I'm going to put on my hat that says I'm representing the company going after somebody who may be violating a post-employment restrictive covenant. The first thing that I do is I send you a cease and desist letter. And in the letter, I say, you signed this contract. Here's a sample of that, the stuff that you agreed to. And you need to tell me you're not going to violate the document going forward, or I'm going to sue you. I also send the exact same letter to your new employer. And I tell that employer, you, Mr. or Mrs. Employer, have hired this person, and this person has a relationship with me. And that relationship does not allow them to do what they're doing with you. And if you stay with that person as your employee, I will sue you as well. And I'm not going to sue you for non-solicit or non-compete because we're not privy to that contract. I'm going to sue you for tortious interference of a contract. So that I have a deal with this person. You hired them. Now you're going to be sued. And what happens in almost every circumstance is that new company that hired you fires you that day, because they're not going to put up with litigation. They're not going to have that risk over their head. And that's why so many employers today ask the new prospective employees, hey, do you have any post-employment restrictive covenants? Because if you do, I want to read them. So these things become the scarlet letter of our industry, of all working Americans. You are chased by your former company because they're so fragile. They're so terrified that you're going to do something that's going to hurt their reputation. So they're enforced by this mechanism. So even before you ever go to court, Matt, you are already lost your job. It's over. It doesn't matter anymore. And if you do have the misfortune to go to court, how much does this cost? at a conservative estimate, $5,000 to $10,000 a month. On the higher dollar figures, $20,000, $50,000. You can't do it. You will go bankrupt. And that's the whole purpose. So to use our legal system as a weapon against working Americans is not only terrible as a business, but it is endemic. It's everywhere. And that's why I have been such an advocate against these things, because they are not good for anybody in any part of this industry.
No, I'm with you. Have you ever, I don't think I've ever seen you be asked this, or I don't think I've ever asked this. Have you ever had one of these logistics companies or not logistics companies that's huge on the non-competes, send you a message like, you got to stop spreading this awareness against non-competes, or, ever get a message like that?
So I use the example of TQL. I respect so many people that work for TQL. That is a very challenging company to work for. And it's a very tough industry. But what I have is dozens of their people will reach out, or at least they'll look at my profile, for example. But the corporation will never let me follow them on Twitter. And if they're listening, and I'm probably sure they are, I'd love to follow you on Twitter. I'd be very friendly. I'm very reasonable. But no, people don't usually reach out to me and say, hey, stop doing this. That would be problematic, I think. What people typically try to do is really kind of make it sound like this is a benign thing. Like, we always do it. We don't enforce it. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. And at this stage, consumers are not willing to make buying decisions based on how people use post-employment restrictive covenants. And so as long as there's no penalty for doing them, you're not going to see them stop unless something changes. Well, the FTC's got its own thing, but maybe you could even make a forced disclosure where you have to tell prospective employees, hey, we make you sign non-competes in the job description. That is, again, not legally required, but would be a nice change.
Will, do you know how to put comments up yet on StreamYards? We had a question from Kevin, it looks like.
If you click on the name, it'll pop up. It should anyway. Click on, there it goes.
Yeah, there.
Yeah. So Kevin, that's a great question. The question here is, does this perhaps create a reason for individual states to create their own employment laws surrounding non-competes? Absolutely. So I'll use Illinois as an example. So I'm an Illinois-based attorney. I have all the paperwork for the state of Illinois, the Northern District of Illinois, and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. What we do in Illinois is you must give the worker 14 days to review any non-compete and any non-solicit. We also have a requirement that you have to make over a certain dollar amount in order for it to be binding. So there are protections we put in place in different states. Every state does it differently. And so some states like California ban non-competes outright. Some of them have restrictions like Illinois. But what we find, I think, and why the FTC made this move is they believe it's unfair competition. They believe it's not fair to starve your competitors of talent and to keep people's wages low. So that's why they made the federal rule. I would love to see a broader ban from Congress, because that would not be challenged the way this one is. But yes, the states are making rules. They're making them every day. And if you're a business that has non-competes, understand this. You may win the FTC fight, but this fight against non-competes, you will lose it. Like, the tides of history are moving in a direction, and that direction is not in your favor. So make the adjustment now before you're forced to do it later on and have litigation or something that's going to cause you a lot of problems.
Throw up some more comments here.
So this says that not confident lobbyists will allow Congress to move forward. Lobby and PAC money funds a lot of congressional campaigns. Yeah, so this is a great question. And this is a great point. So why does the Workforce Mobility Act, even though it has bipartisan support, not become a law? Because lobbyists don't want it to be a law. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is suing. For one reason, they don't think the FTC has the authority, but secondarily, they don't want to see wages rise. Like, that's what happens. Like, you ban non-competes, wages will rise. That is a functional truth that's going to happen. And companies don't want that. And I understand why they don't want that.
Do you think in the states it has, because I think there's 4 states now, maybe 5 that have banned it. Obviously they got through the lobbyists in those states, but I'm guessing, that was years and years long process. I mean, so do you foresee at someday Congress, if the Supreme Court rejects this and, non-competes, have to be decided by Congress, do you envision that happening in the next couple of years? Or
I think absolutely. My gut tells me that we scratch the surface of the deep unfairness of non-competes with the thousands of people who made comments. And so now you have the trends and forces of history looking at this issue in a new way. And I think the way to look at non-competes is not about this is a business making a contract with a worker. This should be looked at as an issue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you negotiate contracts and you look at the data, women and people of color are disproportionately impacted by the inability to negotiate with the hiring entities. That's why wages are the way that they are. So I think over time, this pendulum will move. And I'll also say this, if it doesn't, like I will run for office as a Republican or a Democrat. I don't care, as a single issue candidate, which is I will ban non-competition agreements. I will fight for that one thing. And when it's done, I'll resign and be gone. But like, this is the thing we have to do. We have to choose battles that are worth fighting. And this is one that is absolutely worth fighting. To think that you would give up your right to do a job to somebody else for nothing. Like, the thing I want to make sure very people clear about, if you're a C-level person, you have a non-competition agreement, they pay you while you wait. They pay you for a year as you sit out. That does not happen with anybody else. So to think that this is a very fair negotiation between a hiring entity and a worker is just absolutely absurd. That's why, again, I'm so viciously against non-competition agreements.
Do you think, I think Nate, or we got another comment.
Yeah, they did hashtag Leffler for president.
We can put that in that. That sounds great. No, so remote workers, this is another really good question. So this is why this stuff is so complicated. So look, remember, I graduated law school in 2010. I am a fully accredited lawyer. I have a law firm. I have all these different things. Most people can't understand these documents. What they do is they have a choice of law clause. In the document, there is a thing that says the law of this state will apply in any disputes. That is the law that is going to be used by like the Ohio company, TQL. They'll have their choice of law is Ohio. So if you're working in a different state, let's say you're working in North Dakota and you get sued in Ohio, you're like, why am I being sued in Ohio? Because you agreed to it. I didn't know I agreed to that. Of course you don't, because you're not a lawyer. That's what I would have told you to do. So if you're working in a different state, you can still have this whole thing happen. If you're in California and you're sued in Ohio and you get a judgment against you and they try to bring it to California, California will say, I don't care what your choice of law clause was. I don't care what Ohio says. This is my citizen. So yours in your state that you live in may impact how it's enforced against you, but the choice of law in the contract is what's going to govern how the contract's interpreted. And I'll also mention another caveat. A lot of times people say, well, Matt, it sounds like this is overly broad, probably unenforceable. Incorrect. Every one of these contracts, and almost everyone I've ever seen, has this thing called a savings clause. And the savings clause essentially says, if the court finds any part of this unenforceable, the court will remake it and make it enforceable. So you might say the non-compete's 5 years. The court says, you know what? It should only be 1 year. You're still bound for the 1 year. So like, it's called blue penciling. So this is how pernicious these things can be. They will get you because there are people who have spent thousands and thousands of dollars drafting very good contracts to take away your rights. That's the purpose of these things.
That's an interesting point. I was always under the impression that if it were deemed just too long, right, that it would just be unenforceable in full, not that they would lower it down to say 1 year. So that's I didn't know that.
And that's one of the things like that. I appreciate that, Nate. Thank you very much. I appreciate your support. For anyone who wants to fight non-competition agreements, I'm happy to have that conversation. But the reality is, like, this is a deeply unfair practice. It is designed to prey on people who are not educated with these topics, with no time or money to afford an attorney, and to lock them in. We should not accept those. We should not allow those. And so the best defense is just simply not sign them. Here's a question. Do you typically see non-competes that are broad in terms of where you cannot work? For example, you work for a broker. Do they ban you from working for a carrier, both in transportation, but not exactly competing? Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So I'll give the example of Jimmy John's. We all love those freaky fast sandwiches. So many people may not realize that for a period of time, Jimmy John's had a 2-year non-competition agreement. And the non-competition agreement said if you work at one of our places, you can't work at any competing store within 3 miles of one of our locations. And they defined a competing business as one that had 10% of their revenue coming from sandwiches. So
Wow.
That's crazy that Jimmy Jones is doing non-competes for.
welcome to America. Welcome to America. So what ends up happening is, and this is to Rob's question, be more specific in our industry. Yes, that's what happens. I'm going to use TQL because there's litigation that's actually happened with them on this issue. When a broker goes to work for a motor carrier, they have sued that broker at the motor carrier who's doing just transportation stuff. So it really boils down to what is the hiring entity's appetite for litigation. But these things can be written in such a way, like if you're a broker, you can't even drive a truck. Like they can do this. Now, sometimes they won't sue you for that, but the possibility exists. And even when they're found to be overly broad, to that point we talked about just a second ago, they can rewrite it. They can make it enforceable. So again, like these things are far more dangerous than most people give them credit for. And again, 30 million people, that's bananas.
Yeah. So when I left the company that I was at brokering before starting Black Box, I had a non-compete, non-solicit, and we had it reviewed by a lawyer, and he deemed it to where he thought it was fine if I worked on the carrier side. So I founded a dispatching company. It was kind of my workaround to stay in touch with the industry without leaving. And I guess our contract wasn't broad enough, and it wasn't enforceable, or at least the previous company didn't seem fit to pursue it. So that was kind of our workaround for the non-compete. So,
and isn't that depressing? I mean, again, in the broadest sense of things, you learn to do something so well, and you have a company, either you don't like the industry or you don't like the leaders, and your choice is to go make a totally separate thing. I mean, in America, we so often build our identity with what we do. We are what we do every day. And to be able to take away someone's identity through a contract they don't understand is deeply un-American. But there are ways to work around these things. There are ways to circumvent non-competes or circumvent non-solicit to still comply with the letter of the law. But it is a thing that we shouldn't have to do. Every worker, everyone who's watching this probably is an at-will employee, which is to say, you get fired for whatever reason, as long as it's not a protected reason. So you have no protections. And yet the employer can have tentacles or hooks in you for the next year or 2 years, asking, who are you working for now? What are you doing? Who are you talking to? And they have a right to know because we gave it to them, which again, we ought not to do.
I think some extremes too. I mean, I don't know if you hear these cases too, but I hear from, some employees, the extremes that some of these companies go to find out, like you said, asking questions of where you're at, doing searches, leaving emails up for 6 months. I mean, it gets pretty in depth of kind of the degrees. I think some companies have whole departments just to track ex-employees, or at least I've heard that. I don't know if that's true, but
I think it's very true. The way that so let's say we go back to that example of how litigation happens. So first it's a cease and desist, then it's litigation, then it's discovery. And what is discovery? Discovery is asking questions about what you're up to. They can subpoena your cell phone records. They can subpoena your social media records. There's nothing you can hide from a lawyer who understands how to ask the right question. And this is what happens. Hiring entities, employers tend to be so proud of the value they give to customers and how differentiated they are from everybody else. And yet you see the fragility of them when they think that they might lose somebody. I mean, it's not a trade secret to say, I know Steve over here, right? That's not a trade secret. But people pretend like it is. It's not the Coca-Cola recipe. It's the guy who's over at that manufacturer. And again, we give up a lot of rights we don't necessarily understand, and people need to have access to attorneys, need to have these contracts disclosed well in advance of a potential hiring event.
definitely. It's well, I guess kind of to get to the other topic, I'm sure some people will be interested in too, but might not know as much about. I think it came out, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the same day as this FTC ruling came out, the Labor Department ruled, because there's always been this issue of exempt versus non-exempt, and several lawsuits going on currently, or one that was resolved. But now, in order to have employees be non-exempt or salaried, in another word, I believe, now you're going to have to pay them $58,000. So does that, my first impression, does that stop brokerages some of these brokerages will pay $40,000, $45,000, $35,000 salaries and have exempt employees. And that, from my understanding, that's going to eliminate that, correct?
Yeah, the way to look at the Department of Labor's new rule around like what qualifies for overtime based on like a salary range. Let's kind of unpack it a couple different ways. So you're either exempt or you're non-exempt. That's like the first thing you ask. An exempt employee is someone who is not going to qualify for overtime. If you're exempt from overtime, you don't get any overtime pay. The example I give is usually like administrative personnel, like managers, lawyers. We're all generally non-exempt. We're all generally exempt. We can't get overtime. A non-exempt employee is typically like a clerical, low-level kind of person, a production employee, kind of a way to look at it. And the brokers have gotten in trouble, and we're going to go back to our friends at TQL. Last year, this is a fascinating case. In 2010, they were sued for misclassifying entry-level brokers. These are called Logistics Account Executive Trainees, or LAETs. The LAETs were essentially trainees. They're just training. They just joined the company. They're making phone calls or chasing boards. They're doing administrative work. That litigation has been going on for 14 years. For 14 years, TQL has fought this, and they lost in 2023. And what they found in the liability finding was 4,500 people who worked in Ohio were misclassified as exempt when they were actually non-exempt. They were essentially clerical staff who were owed overtime. What we learned in that litigation was those people were working up to 60 hours a week, nights, weekends, holidays. They had to be available for Saturdays, and they were only paid a salary with no commission draw. And the Labor Commission, they sued. There was a class action lawsuit, and they were found to be liable. And the most fascinating thing about that whole litigation is the deposition of Ken Oakes. And Ken Oakes is asked in deposition, hey, why did you make a choice to make these people exempt as opposed to non-exempt? Did you ask lawyers? No. Did you ask your in-house counsel? No. Who'd you ask? I asked TIA. What? Wait, hold on. You asked TIA?
Is TIA changing?
What? That's absurd. And so in that litigation, he was found to have acted not in good faith. And so they had to double the overall penalty. It might be over $200 million they pay for misclassifying those workers. Who typically funds legal support for groups of people in class action lawsuits? 100 TQL employees filing suit under California might get competitors off the employer to pay legal support. No, no one funds litigation. So let me be very clear. Most plaintiff litigation, that's wrongful death, that's labor stuff, those are on a contingent fee basis, which is to say the lawyer makes no money unless they win. And if they win, they take a third. If they don't win, they take nothing. The costs of court must be paid for by the client. The lawyer may advance it, and they sometimes do, but they must be reimbursed by the client. That being said, there are banks that specifically finance litigation, and they will finance the litigation on behalf of the plaintiff. They'll maybe pay some housing costs, whatever they might pay. They might pay some of those things and then take an interest in it, but it's not very typical. There is not a cabal of people trying to fund plaintiff attorneys to go chasing after corporations. What ends up happening is someone gets disgruntled and they get really mad, and they learn about ways to go after their former employer. So to back up to the question on the Department of Labor stuff, the Department of Labor is always skeptical to an extent of what businesses do. And here's the example I like to use. If you're a retail worker and you become a manager, oh, wow, you're a manager now. You have 10 direct reports. You're making $35,000 a year, and you're working 50, 60 hours a week. The Department of Labor said, look, if you're going to call someone a manager, you're going to pay them over a certain dollar amount. We're not going to let you hire someone, call them a manager, which makes them exempt, and then work them for 70 hours. We're not going to do that. And so the new rule by the Department of Labor is basically adding a higher dollar amount that you get paid as an exempt employee that allows you to still be exempt. The real issue here, guys, was there were managers who were working so many hours, they were making under minimum wage on a per hour basis. And that's bananas. Again, this is just the way these things work. So this newer rule by the Labor Department has basically raised what the bar is going to be for someone to be an exempt employee.
Interesting.
I mean, as an employer for the non-exempt employees, for just the nature of this industry, it's kind of tough to track the overtime. Say if you're a broker, you get like you have a load posted during standard office hours, and you go home and a call rolls over to your cell phone. They take the call, they book the load. Do they need to clock in for the 12 minutes that they're working at night? It just becomes a nightmare. So I know that when that ruling came out, we met with our lawyer and we're going over and we're just kind of racking our brains, like so every time somebody gets called, do they need to log it? Like, how do we track it? Do we know if they're actually working, or they just, it's a whole thing.
It's the compliance aspect is very challenging. I'd say that if they're pure salary people and they're working a lot of hours, there's a likely chance that they would be considered non-exempt to get paid for that. If they're making commissions or making draws, it's probably a different thing. But I will say, Will, this is one of the interesting things about that ruling is it's only going to accelerate the trend of automation, and it's only going to accelerate the trend of offshoring. Like, the reason why you offshore is not because it's so effective. It's about, I don't like the labor laws in the country that I live, and I want to find a way to reduce the exposure and reduce the cost and ultimately save money for my customers.
Yeah, I mean, we started both of those. We started using some automation and some offshoring this past year. So
it's the trend, man. There's nothing you can do. This industry does not support the kind of margin we're used to. I mean, it's a feast or famine business, but it's not going to get, even when it does get better, it's never going to be like it used to be. There's so much more ways to save money, and people are going to continue to follow those paths.
Does commission, you can still be those class action. I don't know if you've been following the fifth wheel lawsuit.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So that one, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I believe those reps are being paid commission too, salary plus commission. So you can still be sued for, filing people, non-exempt, even if you're paying them commission. Is that accurate? Just harder to do?
I think the way to look at it is like, you can sue for about anything. To win a verdict, you have to meet a certain level of facts, and you have to have the law on your side. So I think it becomes a more difficult lift to say I am an exempt employee and I'm non-exempt, but I'm making commission and I have a salary. That makes it a little bit more challenging. I don't know the answer to that. The case is still fairly new, but you can still make those claims. I just don't know how effective they're going to be. In the TQL litigation, which was the one that I'm most familiar with, it was really about the logistics account executives and then these juniors that were making the transition into being full-on brokers. There were only salary, no commission, and working well over 40 hours a week.
So those are the ones that are most likely. So you'd be less. You think the fifth wheel lawsuit is probably less likely for them to win against fifth wheel as opposed to TQL?
It's hard to say. I think the answer is going to be, it depends. I think no one wins in this litigation. So that's a fun side fact for everyone here, is that there is not a single liability policy as an employer that you can buy that can protect you from wage and hour claims. Like, there's no insurance that sells a product that protects you from wage and hour, which means every bit of litigation is out of your operating capital, and it can very quickly destroy a business. I mean, if you're making 10% margin and you're spending $20,000 a month, you got to do $200,000 of new revenue to just make up the difference of the money you're losing in litigation. So it's a very difficult place to be in. And that's why employers need to be proactive with their workers and with their lawyers to say, hey, here's what I'm doing. Can you tell me that it's okay? Like, we PM our trucks, let's PM our contracts too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
No, that one was interesting too, because if I was reading correctly, they were tracking employees' cell phones, like installing some app where if an employee was at Taco Bell or after hours, like pretty much anywhere, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this app like tracked their every move in and out of the office. Like, they'd be calling reps like, hey, it's 11:30. Why are you at Planet Fitness?
This is the world of surveillance. We don't want the government to surveil us, but oh my goodness, do we love when other companies surveil our activities, whether it's our businesses or the people who provide us our cell phones or the computers. Everything is tracked. And the thing is, people have been so comfortable with the idea of being anonymous, but it's not the case. And that's why you see like the encroachment of like driver facing cameras in trucks. Like this surveillance culture is coming, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
So I'll say this for our payroll, everything, when people clock in, we didn't set this up. It just comes with the system, but it'll tell us where they clocked in at. So if somebody clocks into the office and they're at home, it'll show me that they're not at the office. it doesn't keep an active surveillance on them, but it'll let me know if they're actually in the office when they clock in, or if they're clocking in when they're actually running 45 minutes behind. And that's actually been super helpful because it happens. People running 20 minutes late, they clock in while they're getting out of the shower. It's like, hey, man, all right, you're late.
There's been some fascinating litigation. I mean, just recently, BNSF here in Chicago, they got hit with over $100 million verdict for violating a law in Illinois called the Biometric Information Privacy Act, BIPA, which is a great thing to say. And essentially, drivers would scan in with their fingertip or their eyes to get into the rail yard, and they weren't giving disclosures about what was happening to that data, and that's how they got dinged. So a lot of times, our technology outpaces our ability to regulate it, and this new way of everything being connected all the time, there's gonna be a lot of interesting things as time goes on, but it makes sense. That's the nature of technology. That's how it goes.
No, it's real interesting. We'll see what happens in that. So, and they go on for so long too. I mean, what do you think it'll be 5 years before we know the result of this next exempt litigation?
Yeah, I mean, most people are going to try and settle these things. Very few companies have the operating cash to deal with these litigations for very long. So many brokerages are on the cusp of insolvency right now. I mean, we've lost 1,500 or so in the last, let's say 12 months. So there is a lot of very tenuous positions, and you get this type of litigation, it just exacerbates the problem of not having enough cash to keep running. So I think we're going to see some of these companies that are being sued, maybe they don't make it, so maybe they do. We have International Road Check next week. Maybe more companies will shut down before that. So who knows? It's a very fascinating time, as it always is in transportation.
Are there any other legal, besides the non-compete and the labor ruling, any other big lawsuits you're following or hearing about?
There's some big things to talk about. We know that the FMCSA will be putting out the speed regulation relatively soon. That's going to mean every single truck that's on the highway will have to go to a shop and be recalibrated with their ECU to go a certain speed. That's a big deal. It's very, very big deal. We know that the road check's coming up next week. And just for everyone who's watching and listening, let me give you a quick rundown of road check. Over the next, from May 14th to May 16th, about, let's say 60 to 70,000 trucks and trailers will be inspected. 1 in 5 will fail because our maintenance of our commercial vehicles is not great. About 20% or so of every vehicle on the highway as a commercial vehicle is unsafe at any speed. And we'll see a lot of trucks get put out of service, and then they'll get fixed and they'll go back on and they'll continue to operate that way. And I like to use the analogy of if I was a grocery store and I had 5 gallons of milk, and I said, one of these gallons of milk is unsafe, you'd say, Matt, I don't want to buy that milk. And I'd say, I'm sorry, that's the only milk you can choose. And that's our supply chain. It's an amazing thing. It's a very exciting thing.
And just for any brokers watching, a lot of drivers will sit out during Blitz Week to not risk being put out of service or paying any kinds of fines. So, I mean, you can expect rates to be up a little bit, capacity to be a little bit up. So don't be surprised when you have that load that you keep refreshing and nobody's calling on it. Go ahead and get your trucks.
There's always a workaround.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting.
Are you hearing too? This is one thing I was meaning to ask you too, because you see, I'm on Twitter a little bit more the last couple months, and drivers in the driving industry seem to be very interested in this lease on owner operator or 1099, ruling that was made, and you don't hear much about it on the broker side. I mean, it seems to be getting more popular in a sense, 1099 freight agents, but it seems to be a big, I don't know what the right word, at least on Twitter, a big topic of conversation for a lot of drivers. Is it just viewed differently, the 1099 in the carrier side than it is on the brokerage side? Or I don't totally follow all of what some of the arguments are.
The greatest innovation in supply chain in the last 50 years was independent contractors. If you go back to 1980, which is right when the deregulations of the Motor Care Act of 1980 was around, about 60 to 70% of all truck drivers were union truck drivers. They were employees, W-2s of the Yellows and the Roadways and the CFs, and that's what they did. But deregulation allowed for this amazing technology through the law that said, I'm going to get you to do exactly what you're doing right now, but I'm not going to pay your health insurance. I'm not going to pay you for time off. I'm not going to pay you any overtime or anything special like that. I'm going to pay you as a vendor and you're going to be a business owner. So if you go back to this, this is a story that I love because my father was really on the cutting edge of this. He was a roadway guy who then went to make his own company as a maintenance provider for a company called RPS, Roadway Package System. RPS was Roadway's version of UPS without the unions. That company, RPS, became FedEx Ground. Every time a ground driver comes to your house, they are not an employee of Ground. They're a contractor. Same with Amazon. That is a contractor who works for them as a dedicated service provider. So in the world of independent contractors, in the world of trucking, there is this bifurcation. You're a W-2 company driver or you're an independent contractor. They do the same job. They have different levels of control. But that is this fundamental question of who really is your boss. And over time, we've seen these new things develop, which is like this lease on thing, where I'm an independent contractor. I lease the truck from the motor carrier. The motor carrier gets to tell me exactly where to go. And it really looks and feels like an employment relationship, except it's not an employment relationship. At least in some states, it's not. So this is this trend that, again, our law and our technology are kind of going in different directions. And this independent contract question is going to be with us until they're all robots. So this is going to stay with us for decades and decades and decades.
You also save a lot of money on taxes to 999 versus employee. Actually, the first brokerage I went to go work for, they listed us all as contractors, but we were employees and we had set hours and everything. It was crazy, actually, looking back on it.
It's really weird. Like the thing is, like I love to make this parallel. Like if you're an independent contractor, you probably can take in more money than a company driver. You probably can. The thing that happens is, let's say you're at the shipper and you fall and you hurt your knee or you hurt your back. What happens? If you're a W-2, you file for workers' compensation. You get essentially 2/3 of your salary until you've recovered. In the world of a contractor, you're fired. You could lose a route and you could lose your job. And if you're an employee, you file for unemployment and you get paid until you find a new job. If you are an independent contractor, you don't qualify for unemployment. So it's about, for the hiring entity, it's about them reducing risk, about reducing cost and passing that on to the driver, and then trying to persuade the driver that that is good for them. And again, I'm not going to tell anyone that they should be a company or should be a W-2 or should be a contractor, but understand that trade-off, because when things are bad and you're a contractor, nothing's going to help you. You're on your own. That's how it works. If you're a company guy or gal, something happens, you get hurt, you get disability, you get all these different things. So there's a lot of nuances to it, but it is an interesting thing that we will never see the end of.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's interesting because you see a lot more complaints like on the brokerage side, like JB Hunt just opened up a 1099 agent program. A lot more agent programs are opening up and you don't really hear it as much, but I think the difference is maybe on the brokerage side is you're not going to go like fall and, hurt your knee, at your desk and, have this big workman's comp. I mean, I guess you theoretically could, but and then I think the pay difference, as a W-2 versus 1099 in the driving industry is maybe a little bit different than the pay difference on the brokerage side. Just you don't hear about it on the brokerage side as much as you hear about it on the carrier side.
Yeah, and I'll push back on the broker side. So the most typical, I was a workers' comp attorney for a period of time. The most typical things you see in workers' comp, besides like if you're a truck driver or mechanic, there's physical injuries, but it's carpal tunnel. It's simple things you did from sitting every day. Those are actual claims that really impact your ability to make money. And so as a hiring entity, what we want as a hiring entity is, I want all the benefits of you making revenue for me, but I want none of the liability of anything that you do. I don't want to give you time off. I don't want to give you paid holidays. I want to give you insurance. Just go do your thing. And then if you go well, it's great. If it doesn't matter because I'll hire another agent. So it cuts both ways, but I do see the same trend, Matt. Like there is this growth of these independent contractor models, and they have different degrees of effectiveness. Captain America, that's right.
Well,
Did you see John's comment too? John's made a couple comments too. I don't think we put up any of his, but he said looking forward to hearing Matt squared.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, like, this is the part that I want to really emphasize, because I think you guys are more on the brokerage side. I want people to understand a couple of interesting things here. The minimum insurance required to operate a commercial vehicle is $750,000. That was established in 1980. It has never been raised. It has never been raised. To operate a truck in our industry, to run a truck and trailer, it's about 2 cents a mile. It might, sorry, about $2 a mile. It varies, but it's about $2 a mile to cover the maintenance and the asset and all the other pieces. We are moving freight below the operational cost of trucks. That is very dangerous. And we know as an industry, we are vastly underinsured. So this two-pronged thing we have to keep in mind of is we do not have adequate insurance, in my opinion, and we have very poorly maintained equipment, and we have rates that are underneath the operational cost. So these are things that we really do need to understand, like long-term what happens. But to John's question, when the market gets bad, the place the motor carriers cut first is maintenance. They will defer the maintenance, hoping that someday things get better, and hopefully that someday happens before something really, really bad happens.
Oh, no, definitely. So go ahead, Bill.
I was just saying, I mean, that's a great point, especially with Blitz coming up. Talk about 1 in 5. Maybe we see an increase this year.
Very well could. Albus, as we get closer to wrapping up, there's one other case that I really want everyone to understand. And this case is going to impact brokers, it's going to impact motor carriers, and ultimately it will impact customers at the, getting their merchandise. That is the case of Werner Enterprises in Texas. I'm going to walk through the facts briefly for folks who don't know it, and then I'm going to explain why it's so dangerous. But the story is basically this. A driver for Werner is traveling in the snow under the posted speed limit. He is operating that truck safely. There's no mechanical defects. In the opposite lane, opposite side of the road, a pickup truck loses traction, loses control, spins out, crosses 10 yards of median, and collides head-on with the truck operated by Werner. This results in one dead child and another child that's been paralyzed. And the question you have to ask is, who is responsible? Well, it went to trial. And at trial, the driver for the pickup truck was found to be 16% responsible. The driver for the truck for Werner was found to be 14% responsible. And Werner was found 70% responsible. They were hit for a verdict of $90 million. They appealed that verdict, and on appeal, they lost. Now, with all the interest, it's over $130 million. It is on appeal right now to the Supreme Court of Texas. And the question will be, what happens if that case is upheld? There is nothing that driver could have done from Werner to avoid that collision.
What was the reasoning that they convicted? Was it because he shouldn't have been on the road in the first place? Was that the justification? Or
there's a couple pieces. One, this driver had only been as a driver for Werner for 7 days, brand new driver. The trainer for the driver was asleep in the berth. So the trainer could not help say, hey, you should go slower or whatever. So there was that piece of it. The other piece was the dispatch had said, hey, this is a just-in-time load. You need to get this thing delivered. So the driver was going, what they said was too fast for conditions. But the reality, Matt, is this is just law generally. Don't take a case with a dead child to trial. Like, you're never going to win. I mean, at the end of the day, there was no way that passenger vehicle had enough insurance to cover those horrifying deaths. And so Werner was the biggest target, and that's why they were targeted, and that's why they found the liability. It's bananas.
So one thing that you said that I found interesting, so it was under appeal, but they're still charging interest on the money owed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So we call that pre-judgment interest. And then after a judgment, it's called post-judgment interest. There is always interest in the world of law. We know how to get paid. We know how that works.
Yeah.
Well, you think Werner has the risk of going, I mean, Werner's obviously massive, but $130 million. I mean, do they have, with this type of market and trucking companies going under left and right? I mean, is there any danger to Werner?
No, not at all for them. So typically, I don't know for sure, but typically a fleet like Werner will self-insure for the first $10 million. And then they'll have, like an umbrella policy for anything above that. But what that does mean, though, is if you're a motor carrier coming into Texas, your rates are going to be high. Like the insurance adjusters understand this case, and they will bake that case into all of their premiums. So all of us as Americans will end up having to pay more in order to deal with the raise of insurance rates. That's why they keep going up the way that they do.
That's interesting.
You see John's comment. This is why we have the truck ambulance chaser law firms.
Yeah.
There was a world that I would have done that, but that's not my wheelhouse. I'd rather make the industry better than go and destroy giants.
Well, it was good having you. Or sorry, go ahead, Will.
No, I was just gonna definitely. Yeah, we greatly appreciate you having on and have you coming on the show and breaking everything down for us. You provided some great insights. I definitely learned a lot in the hour that you joined us and really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it, guys. The thing I would say is oftentimes law seems like unreachable. It seems like it's something totally foreign. And my hope, my goal is always to try to take these really complicated things and try to make them make more sense. And so having a chance to come on here and talk with you guys has been a great pleasure. I cannot wait to be back, and I cannot wait for you guys to continue to grow the podcast. So thank you for having me as the first guest. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again, Matt.
Yeah, we appreciate the support. All right, that'll do it for episode 1. 2 dogs, 1 pod. We're logging off.
Sounds good. Just before we go, thanks again to Sales-CRM, Trillo for doing all of our some of our marketing and our bios. Obviously, Black Box and HT Ships, and yeah, we'll be back again next week, and we will be able to stream, I think, from my page and have an event and have the logos. We're working on some stuff, so.
Be sure to go to our page, give it a like, turn on notifications. We appreciate everybody that tuned in this time and look forward to doing it again next Friday.
Don't sign non-competes.
Yes, agreed.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.